Welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers podcast, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princetonians where we talk about issues impacting our Black and Brown communities. Well, Ray, I think we should welcome each other back because we sort of had a unscheduled hiatus there.
Yes, unfortunately we did, but and Michelle, I have been so busy. I've been running around, traveling all over the place. So, and I know our schedules, jibing all the time. But finally, we managed to come up for air and, refocus ourselves and get back in the swing of things with our show.
In light of that, I think our listeners will be delighted to learn that today we have a guest who's going to talk about some issues that are really popping off now. As you know, we have two Indian candidates who are running for the Republican presidential nomination, and both of them are relatively conservative and seem to be against anything that's positive for Black people.
Unfortunately.
Yes. So today our guest is going to speak about that a little bit. And with us today is Prachi Patinkar, who describes herself as an anti-caste, feminist activist, and writer. Born and raised in rural India, Prachi was raised by a freedom fighter grandmother and parents deeply involved in anti-caste, feminist, and peasant movements. Over 2 decades in New York City, she has been an activist, educator, grant maker, and writer. And she's involved in social movements that link the local and the global, such as police brutality and war, migration and militarization, race and caste, women of color feminism, and global gender justice. Through her work with organizations such as Afghan Women's Mission, CAAV, an anti-Asian violence organization in New York City, and the Palestinian Education Project, Prachi has been involved in innovative projects to link social justice movements between the United States and the global South. Prachi believes in the vital power of intersectional and international visions and strategies, which resonate across both Dalit rights and Black lives, also across migrant justice and gender justice, to help build bottom-up change from the local to the global. Welcome to the show, Prachi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Prachi, it's indeed a pleasure. So let's start off by talking about communities of color, and all of our communities of color are not monolithic, but the level of diversity among the South Asian community is really, truly profound. So to get our conversation started today, can you elaborate a little bit more on how diverse the community is, and how would you, categorize yourselves in each particular group in that community?
Yeah, thank you so much, Raymond and Michelle, for having me again, and really appreciate this question to start with. South Asian community is ethnically very diverse. Officially, there's a lot of hundreds of probably ethnic groups in the region, and many ethnic minority dominated states as well in South Asia in particular. And I think this is something that a lot of people around the globe don't know, that there is a deeply oppressive caste system which is ingrained in what it originated from what we know as Hinduism today, which is in the 6th century BC. It was called Brahmanism at the time. So the Brahmanism, Buddhism, these were some of the kind of spiritual tendencies that existed. And in the 6th century BC, Brahmanism was a dominant kind of spiritual tendency where the kind of oppressive caste, the category of Brahmins were the top category, the top caste, dominated and created this system called what we know as the caste system today. And so this caste system that originated from Brahmanism, and that Brahmanism has now become what we know as Hinduism, which is a very complicated thing as well. We can go into that another time. But at this point in time, caste system has come to, it's so strong that it has come to kind of become part of Hinduism. It's become part of Islam, and it's become part of Christianity in India itself. So caste system is ingrained in all areas of life in India. And so there are various different and multiple caste groups that exist all across the country, and they take on different forms based on which state and which ethnic area that you're part of. So, dominant ethnic and caste communities are overly represented, as you can imagine, in the way that it works in the US also. In India and other parts of South Asia, they're overly represented in political positions and used in all kinds of powerful positions, whether it's politics, whether it's media, whether it's universities. In every point, at every field, dominant caste people are dominating and creating decisions and making decisions for everybody else that are most oppressed communities in the country. So indigenous communities, what we're called in South Asia, they're called Adivasi communities. Some areas they're called Janajati communities in Nepal. And those communities are kind of seen as kind of the original inhabitants in the same way that we see that in the US as well. So in many ways, they have a lot in common with indigenous communities all over the world, right? They are protectors of the land, they're protectors of the nature. They want to care for the land, they want to care for the people and communities as well. And then culturally speaking, there is a very much in kind of erosion of how their cultural knowledge and the language is there too. So they're fighting for those things as well. So these kinds of things are huge, and caste becoming very important because historically, we can go into this a little bit later, but the caste is one of the biggest kind of leaders of the Dalit community, which is the most kind of bottom community in the caste system. Dr. Ambedkar, who was the leader of the Dalit community, he drafted the Indian Constitution, and he called the caste system a graded hierarchy, a graded division of laborers. So, right? So, people are kind of put together like a ladder, one over the other, based on what occupation that they do. And the lowest occupation is the most so-called unclean occupation, like manual scavenging or working with leather. And that's done by the people. And so they're thought of as most unclean, most impure people. And therefore the untouchability idea comes from that as well. So it's very vast, it's very different, but caste and indigeneity, I would say, is the biggest kind of thing that comes up as the most historically marginalized communities in that region.
So I saw that California just recently either passed or proposed, I'm not sure where it is in the process, some legislation that would prohibit discrimination by caste, because apparently in the tech bro community, the caste system has limited the ability of some workers to progress in the tech world, because their supervisors or the people that they report to are applying the caste system to them here in the United States.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up, and it's a big part of the kind of the civil liberties issue among the South Asian communities here. And kind of going back to what I was saying about the caste system, because it's a graded hierarchical division of laborers, which has existed in kind of like watertight compartments, right? Because of endogamy, people do not generally marry outside of the caste system. And if they do, you'll see a lot of violence that's created by dominant caste groups if people even try to have any quote unquote love marriages outside of the caste system, right? So it is in order to maintain that division of laborers and maintain the caste system and maintain kind of who does what kind of jobs and occupations, because I think what happens is that upper caste and the dominant caste believe that they are spiritually and from God supposed to be doing this kind of work, right? It is ordained for them to be doing the work that is of the mind, and everybody else is doing the work of the body, right? So that's kind of how it has kind of worked, and it has been written into the way that the spiritual scriptures are written in that way, right? And Brahmanism has told this to centuries it has been told. So Brahmanism has maintained this oppressed caste system. So when some of these people, historically from the 1960s onward to now, people who have come from India, who've been able to come from India and South Asia, have been dominant caste groups, right? So they've been coming here, and majority of them, many of them have been occupying certain kind of occupations. They have been occupations of like the IT sector, etc. They've been in academia. They've been in certain kind of finance jobs, and that is because of what kind of social positions and what kind of class positions they were holding back in South Asia as well. So we're easily able to be part of that kind of class here as well. So now, as more and more people from oppressed caste communities, especially Dalit communities, are coming here because the affirmative action, like laws that were passed in India and in some parts of South Asia, some Dalit communities are able to have opportunities with great difficulty, are coming here and getting into these IT jobs, getting into finance jobs. The upper caste folks who've been here, they're like, wait a minute, this is supposed to be ordained job for me. How did you? Right? And these things are very subtle. The way that the discrimination happens is very subtle, because it's through like, what's your last name? What caste are you? These kinds of questions get asked, and the way that if already dominant caste groups are in managerial positions, who do you think they're going to give, certain kind of jobs to, right? Who do you think they're going to give promotions to, right? Who look like them, or people who they feel connected with, not the oppressed caste communities within their South Asian community. So that is happening so much here. And so some of this work that has been done by coalitions in places like Seattle, in places like California, is very, very important work, and that needs to really continue all over the country.
Okay. So, within the African American community, we have our own version of class and colorism. Colorism in particular, although class does play a part in it too. So it's been interesting to read about the various authors' position comparing U.S. racism, classism, and colorism with the caste system in South Asia. But I think our significant thing is we don't have the religious stamp on it. Right. We have the cultural stamp and the centuries-old practice, like particularly here in DC where I am. The colorism thing is extremely important even today. Right. So if you're a darker African American, and I'm talking about
Michelle.
I see. I'm in the middle, right? I'm not even. I'm not I forget what they call it, but
will be more darker than some oppressed caste people who come from North India. So it's not a one-to-one correlation, but because of the kind of idea of pure and impure, right, and unclean and unclean, that also takes place in the form of colorism, right? So when somebody is darker, sometimes people assume that they come from dominant castes, and that happens as well in some parts of North India.
Okay.
Can I ask a real quick question, since Prachi is giving us a history lesson? Can we also ask you about what was the impact of colonialism on Hinduism or Brahmanism? In other words, bringing that culture over to South Asia, how did that affect the caste system in any way?
That is a really, really important question, actually. And it is important partly because we will hear these days a language of decolonization, language of anti-colonial language coming from Hindu supremacist groups. That is coming from the right now the current Prime Minister of India and the regime. They're talking about decolonization. By removing certain laws that they say were put in place by the British that there, and just shifting the name a little bit and keeping actually the most oppressive parts of it still consistent, right? We'll hear that from the Hindu right in the US and other places as well. When we talk about the caste system, they will say it actually is not, caste is not a word in our language. Caste system is not, and they will say that is imposed by colonialism. In fact, that is not true, right? But what is true is that the British, when they came to came to India, and what was then India and now many parts of South Asia, they worked with the existing social structure of hierarchy to work with the most dominant caste people, which are the Brahmins, and then another couple other castes, to work with them so that they can maintain their power and maintain it through keeping the caste system alive. They had to do that in order to, it's not just the divide and conquer issue, but they had to keep it alive so that they can maintain their power throughout the 150 something years that they existed in the country. So in some ways they introduced and kind of they introduced a census system. They introduced like a way to kind of categorize people that was already part of the categorization in the communities, and they kind of solidified it, right? They gave it names, and they gave it official structure, right? What was already part of the society, what was already being practiced in terms of caste supremacy, what is already being practiced in terms of caste violence and caste discrimination. They gave it a social structure and official structure, and then they worked with the dominant caste people to maintain power. And then they gave them power to be able to kind of continue that work, right? So in some ways, if we can say that caste system didn't originate and didn't come from the British, but they solidified it further and maintained it further.
Wow. So let's pull it all the way forward to see how that's playing out today. Many people who consider themselves to be left of center expect other brown people in the coalitions to always support liberal causes. But we're seeing today, as you mentioned in the UK, a trend where South Asians are being used or are willingly participating, depending on how that works, in the effort to promote some really, really conservative agendas that basically hurt brown people. So, in the UK, we have Sunak, we have Braverman, and here in the US, we have two candidates, Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy, running to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party. So how does what you're telling us about the historical approach take us to this trend that we're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a timely question. Some things that a lot of the South Asian communities trying to figure out how to oppose, actually, right, the tendency within our communities. And I think one thing that I'll start with is to say that it's wrong for us to assume that all Asian communities will have progressive values, or that all Asian communities will connect to in the same way, given the way that racialization, as we know, happens in the United States. Kind of people of color category is not monolithic either, right? We have come, and now by obviously Black Lives Matter has done the most to challenge this idea that actually anti-Black racism and the history of enslavement in this country means very different than what Asian communities and South Asian communities face in this country. That's the first and foremost understanding that a lot of Asian communities have to have, and they have to acknowledge. That's something that I think some folks like us who have been working on caste issues when we came into this country, it was easier for us to understand because we knew that stratification, understood how these kind of supremacist politics and the way that hierarchies, even within communities that are marginalized, worked, right? And so that's one thing. And then it doesn't surprise many of us when we see people like Vivek Ramaswamy, we see people like Nikki Haley be attracted to conservative politics because we see in South Asia what so-called our people are doing and have been doing for thousands of years. So when that kind of supremacist ideology of being superior to other people, being hierarchically better than other people, you carry that anywhere, that stays with you, right? That is part of how you are developed. That's part of what you're told, that you exist in society. And so One thing that isn't, for us, that is not surprising and that should be also challenged and people need to be thinking about within the Indian American and South Asian community when they think about organizing our communities. As we know that in the United States, obviously white supremacy and white nationalism is the kind of the larger framework in which we're working in, but also to understand how Hindu supremacy works alongside white supremacy. It is in some ways two parts of the same coin for many of us, especially for dominant caste, kind of upper oppressed caste communities. For us, they're in some ways, for some communities, for those communities, actually approximate kind of oppression that they face can be a dominant caste oppression, right? And so how do you connect with that then? So that's one thing I'll say. And then Hindu supremacist forces in the United States have been kind of working to, working with, obviously they have been opposing issues like caste discrimination bills in California and Seattle. They're also talking about opposing affirmative action and why in the United States. So they're connected to that politics as well in the U.S. Scene. And I think the fact that some of the other kind of more economic justice issues, because many Hindu Americans and many Indian Americans occupy a certain wealth category also, right? They have a certain, this is a reality that we also have to acknowledge. There are communities that are, of course, working class communities within our South Asian populations that are working in taxi driver and restaurant industry, etc. But there is a big majority, that's a dominant majority, that is still occupying certain kind of jobs, and their net wealth is pretty high, right? And so that comes with a certain kind of socioeconomic view, worldview that brings them closer to more Republican politics, and that's something that we have to acknowledge. Kind of the Hindu supremacists and kind of the class question comes into play when we see more groups of people like Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy kind of coming into that the Republican kind of fold. And actually, over the past decade, Indian American communities have been slowly but steadily shifting towards the Republican Party. There's some data that suggests that there has been actually a 12-point shift even between like 2008 to 2020, right? That's a big shift.
So what accounts for that, Prachi? What accounts for that shift?
I think what accounts for that is the contradictions that I think in some ways that many from our own communities have been, kind of laying bare for people, right? That there are a lot of, oppressed caste communities that are coming here that are challenging the idea of caste oppression in the United States. They're challenging the idea of victimhood that Hindu supremacist groups are more and more taking, right? Hindu supremacist groups will say we're victimized because we face Hinduphobia. In fact, Hinduphobia is not a structural problem, like obviously anti-Black racism is, or even anti-Semitism is. It's not a structural problem in the United States. It may be a xenophobic issue, but it is not a structural problem. So Hindu American community, the supremacists within them, they will, anytime a caste issue is presented, anytime Islamophobia is talked about within our community, they will say you're being Hindu supremacist. And when that is challenged, they're realizing that their allies are actually not the Democratic Party, but the Republican Party. They think like us, act like us, right? And so I think that's one of the reasons I think some of the shift is happening beyond kind of the economic alignment.
That's quite complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot to put your hands on. Yeah.
Now here's what the interesting thing is, and Michelle pointed this out. When it's convenient, politicians or aspiring politicians between Vivek and Nikki Haley will talk about their culture and their background when it's convenient, like when it helps their narrative. Okay, but at the same time, they want to say, but they deny racism, on its face. And that doesn't make sense to us.
I think it's easier to talk about cultural differences and multiculturalism than it is to admit that racism exists. You can have a multicultural framework and at the same time deny racism. You can have a multicultural framework and at the same time deny casteism, right? So even in the Hindu right-wing organizations, they won't completely deny that the caste system exists in the same way. They will say, oh, of course, we have a lot of castes. There are multiple different castes. We live harmoniously, right? It's easier, you can say that while also saying that, well, but we don't discriminate. It's important. Hinduism has so many different kinds of groupings, and it's a good thing to have diversity in that way. But the knowledge of casteism is a whole different thing, right? I think that translates to, oh, there's various different cultures. I come from Hindu culture, and I believe in God just like you believe in God. It's easier to say that than say, no, I actually think there's racism as an important structural issue in this country. So in that way, it maps on,
That yes, that's it's somewhat akin though to the Black Republicans though.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Right.
And the Black
And
Republicans also take advantage of religion, the
yes,
very
yes,
conservative issues that religion brings into this, such as, what we're going through today with abortion. I mean, they were able to grab that section of the Black community, meaning Republicans, through religious issues that affect the Black community in particular, whether it was
yeah, and I think it
go ahead.
also sheds light on the fact that you can be for diversity. For the listeners, I'm using my air quotes as usual, but at the same time be still anti-Black.
Right.
So it's an
Mhm.
interesting place to be right now
Mhm.
in terms of people understanding that diversity doesn't mean non-anti-Black. You can be diverse and also anti-Black. You can be diverse and also be oppressive within the South Asian community. So that's fascinating to me. Now, you mentioned, Prachi, that there's some pushback in the South Asian community to this, this elevated oppressive caste. So talk to us a little bit about what's the pushback when people listen to Nikki Haley and Vivek. What are they thinking? What are they experiencing when they make these statements that the South Asian community is not experiencing racism?
What are people from the South Asian community saying?
Yeah, the ones who are pushing back.
Yeah, I mean, I think, fortunately, even though there's a 12-point shift to the Republican kind of ideology and Republican politics, there are still people, kind of wide section of Indian American and South Asian community, there are still Democratic leaning and have Democratic ideology, right? And so especially the second generation South Asian folks, the young people who are more and more politicized by what is happening in this country, politicized by the racism, politicized by the movements like Black Lives Matter. I think especially those communities and the progressive communities, when they're seeing that, one, there's just pure embarrassment is I would say one feeling among other feelings, but also kind of trying to figure out there's a reckoning, right? That given that there is more and more people, two candidates from our community, Indian American community, in the Republican primary, that is a huge deal, and that is, if there are two kind of conservative candidates right now, what does that say about where our community is moving towards? I think that's the conversation that a lot of people are trying to have. And then what do we need to do to ensure that questions around racism, questions about racialization, questions about solidarity with other communities, especially Black communities, how do we make sure that that is a big part of how we organize and kind of move forward with? Those are the things that I think people are talking about, right? Because we will see that that is what will be exploited. There is deep anti-Black racism within South Asian community. That is a reality, and that many people know that. Is this connected to how this trend is going? How do we connect with that? How do we dismantle that? How do we make sure that this is something that we have to challenge? Is this connected to casteism? Is this connected to Hindu supremacist politics in the way that, and is it connected to geopolitical issues, right? Hindu supremacist community in the United States have been aiding and abetting and funding the rise of the Hindu supremacist and Hindu nationalist regime in India.
Mm.
And Modi is supporting that, and Trump started that. Trump definitely started that, right? And so the fact that a loved Republican, president started this trend of meeting with Modi, the Prime Minister of India, and meeting with the Republican and other communities in the Hindu and Indian communities, that has given a big boost to people in that community to say, maybe this is where our allyship lies. And that's something that people are contending with and challenging and trying to figure out how to deal with, I think.
So, Michelle, I think Prachi set us up really nicely for our next question regarding the South Asian community and the American Black community. How do we, as these two groups, come together, Prachi? I mean, how do we put our resources together, our, the issues that affect both of our communities, and create a more progressive political agenda for each other? Or is that nearly impossible because of, the caste system within the South Asian community? That's
a really good question, and an important one that actually is the crux of all of this. Historically speaking, there has been historical examples of Black and Dalit solidarity for a long time. Dr. Ambedkar, who was the drafter in the Indian Constitution, a known Dalit leader, he was writing letters to W.B. Du Bois back in the time and talking about the connections between what the Dalit community was facing in India and what the Black community was facing in the United States and different parts of the world. So that connection was happening since back in those times. Then in the 1960s, in India, a Dalit Panther Party was formed in inspiration from the Black Panther Party to rise up in militant struggle in the same way that the Black Panther Party was kind of thinking about, formulating in terms of its left ideology, in terms of the service model, in terms of the militancy. They were taking inspiration from that in many parts of India, especially Maharashtra, the state where I'm from, right? So there has been a history of that solidarity for a long time. That's what we need to hold on to, right? This is what we need to remember. And I think in the US too, even in the movement spaces, there are more second generation young people who are Indian and South Asian who are coming up and understanding that they have a role to play and they have a responsibility as fellow people of color, but not Black people, to be in solidarity with, Black communities, to make sure that as other people of color, that you stand in line and shoulder to shoulder in this larger struggle. And so that consciousness is there and that is happening. So I think it is crucial for, both us to do our work in the South Asian community to make sure that this complexity of our kind of dynamics within our community is understood by majority in the US, and especially left and, progressive organizations and movements in the US. Because the Hindu Americans that are from the supremacist politics, they are making inroads because they use the idea of victimhood. So just last week, the Hindu America Foundation, the ED of that organization, which is they're very much in line with the supremacist politics, was speaking at the March in Washington, right? And that is very problematic. Mm. That is something that we should not have allowed to happen. That is our responsibility as South Asians to make sure that our community supremacist people and leaders don't have a seat, and they do not try to get into the seats of progressive liberatory politics.
Right. Well, as always, Prachi, we are astounded when we come to the end of the and there's so many things left that we would.
Do we have to wrap this up?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you, as we do all of our guests, what's the takeaway for our listeners? If you want them to remember one thing, what is it?
The world is at a really difficult time right now. Anti-authoritarianism, supremacist politics and anti-authoritarian politics is merging and across the world, and people are learning from those supremacist ideologies. Supremacists in power are learning from each other, and they're aligning with each other everywhere. In domestic politics, they're doing that. In the global politics, they're doing that. So I think one thing that we can learn is that people who are opposed to those ideologies need to understand all of that and be opposing it together, all of it.
Right. Those are great last words, because we see it happening everywhere, right? And as always, we're a little bit behind in responding to the very organized hate that is happening throughout the world. So we definitely have to step up our work. We appreciate you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Your questions and your the wisdom that you're bringing to this work is also so appreciated. So thank you for having me here.
Right back at you.
Well, Michelle, I just feel like I took an advanced South Asian history course listening to Prachi talk about the differences, even religiously, with her country. And I think we got a lot of work to do to try to recruit more South Asian people into what it is that we as progressives would like to see them do in the future.
Right, and what they, as she pointed out, are in the process of educating themselves about the realities of living here in the United States and dealing with not only the caste system from India, but racism in the United States. So I'm looking forward to her work in the future, and it's definitely something we should keep an eye on.
Yes, absolutely.
If you like what you heard today, please visit our website at www.nubiantigerspodcast.com, where we post all episodes and a resource page with additional information on every podcast subject. You can also find us on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers Podcast channel. Our other social media is on Mastodon, where our handle is at Nubian Tigers Podcast at blacktwitter.io. Our podcast is hosted by Anchor FM, which is now part of Spotify. But if you have a favorite podcast app, we're probably on it. Look for Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.